It began, as most things in war do, with desperation. In the early 1940s, the world was burning, and the American war machine needed something it didn't yet have: a vehicle that could swim. Troops and supplies had to move not only across continents, but across the thin blue lines that divided land and sea. The beaches of Europe and the Pacific were not friendly places. They were the edges of hell itself. To win, the Allies needed a way to breach them. In quiet workshops far from the front, engineers were handed a nearly impossible order: build a truck that could roll down a road and drive straight into the ocean, and then keep going. What they created was as strange as it was brilliant. A 212-ton GMC truck wrapped in steel and sealed like a ship's hull. They called it the DUKW, though soldiers quickly shortened it to Duck. At first glance it looked awkward: part boat, part truck, neither at home on land nor water. But what it lacked in grace, it made up for in ingenuity. The D stood for 1942, U for utility, K for all-wheel drive, and W for dual rear axles. Together, those letters named one of the most unique vehicles of the Second World War, a floating contradiction that would soon earn its place in history. Yet the Duck almost never made it past its first test. Early prototypes rolled into the water like stubborn oxen, sluggish and heavy, fighting against the waves. Steering was poor, the engines flooded easily, and the Army brass weren't convinced. Amphibious trucks seemed like a novelty, until the sea reminded them that novelty can mean survival. In June of 1942, the Duck was sent for trials on Michigan's Crystal Lake. The first tests went well. Encouraged, the Army decided to try it on open water near Virginia Beach. But the ocean has a way of humbling invention. When the Duck met its first real surf, the propeller torque twisted its bow toward the waves, broadside. Water swamped the cabin, killing the engine and the bilge pumps. The Duck was shoved helplessly onto the sand, its crew soaked and shaken, its designer watching in silence. The test had failed, but the lesson was priceless. Improvements came quickly: new hull shapes, stronger seals, air-pressured tire systems for sand. By November, 8 new prototypes were ready. They were sleeker, sturdier, and far more capable in 6-foot surf. Still, the military hesitated. The Duck had proven it could float. But could it matter? The answer came one stormy night on the coast of Cape Cod. A Coast Guard auxiliary vessel had run aground in a gale, its 7-man crew trapped and surrounded by waves too violent for rescue boats. Desperate, officers turned to the engineers testing nearby, men with 2 experimental ducks sitting on shore. Against logic, they tried. The strange-looking trucks rolled down the beach, their tires hissing into the surf. Minutes later, they returned with every man alive. It was a small, uneventful rescue in the logbooks of war, but it changed everything. Photographs of that night reached Washington. The Secretary of War presented them to President Roosevelt, remarking that it might have been the first time in history that an Army truck saved a Navy ship. From that moment, the Duck's fate was sealed. It would no longer be an experiment. It would be a weapon of logistics, a machine that could go where no truck belonged. But the ocean never forgets, and neither does time. The same waves that once tested the Duck's courage would decades later return to test its legacy. By early 1943, the Duck had crossed the line from experiment to essential. Factories in Michigan and Illinois began turning them out in the thousands, 21,000 in total by the war's end. On the assembly floor, the smell of oil and paint mingled with the faint metallic echo of urgency. America was building faster than it could think, and the DUKW was proof that necessity could be shaped from steel. Its creators had taken every failure from the first tests and turned it into instruction. The propeller was repositioned for stability, the hull reinforced, and the rudder refined to cut clean through surf. Even the tires were fitted with a pressure control system that could inflate or deflate from the driver's seat, allowing the duck to roll through soft sand where heavier trucks would sink. When the first production models rolled out, they bore the marks of lessons learned through salt, mud, and embarrassment. Engineers and soldiers alike came to respect the ungainly craft. It was still no beauty. It wallowed in the water, its bow lifted high like a stubborn animal. But it worked, and in war, that was all that mattered. The U.S. Army Transportation Corps soon adopted the duck for amphibious logistics, shipping the vehicles to every front where land met sea. In training camps, soldiers learned to pilot them like boats, steering by feel and sound rather than sight. The hull's echo made it difficult to hear anything beyond the engine's droning hum. Water sloshed around the floorboards. Every trip felt half like a mission, half like a prayer. But the duck was reliable. It could carry men, ammunition, or even jeeps. It could drive straight into the waves, float onto the sand, and climb a hill in one motion. To those who used it, it felt like magic, the kind that saved lives instead of taking them. The military soon learned that the duck's greatest strength wasn't speed or armor, but adaptability. It became a bridge when bridges were gone, a ferry where there were no ports, and an ambulance where no road existed. In New Guinea, ducks brought wounded men out of mangrove swamps that would have trapped any other vehicle. In Italy, they delivered artillery shells through flooded plains that had stopped tanks in their tracks. Still, it took one moment of serendipity, that fateful Cape Cod rescue, to secure the duck's destiny. When the news reached the Pentagon, the photographs of a DUKW hauling sailors from the surf spread through military circles like wildfire. Generals who once mocked the floating truck now demanded hundreds. By spring, ducks were being painted olive drab and shipped out under Lend-Lease to Britain, Australia, and the Soviet Union. The Soviets loved them so much, they reverse-engineered their own version, the Gaz-46, nicknaming it the Little Swimmer. By the middle of 1943, the duck was no longer a novelty. It was an indispensable member of the Allied arsenal. In Sicily, it would prove that utility could win wars. In Normandy, it would redefine how armies landed. Soldiers grew attached to the duck in a way they rarely did with machines. It wasn't glamorous, but it was loyal. It didn't complain when overloaded or soaked in salt. It kept moving. You could shoot at it, drown it, or bury it, one soldier joked, and the damn thing would still show up with the mail. The duck was designed for battle, but it carried something far heavier than bullets or bread. It carried trust, and that trust, once earned in war, would later be betrayed in peace. By the summer of 1943, the DUKW had earned its baptism by fire. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, was its proving ground. 1,000 ducks rolled off transport ships into the Mediterranean surf, carrying ammunition, artillery, and men toward a shoreline that had repelled armies for centuries. The landings were chaos, smoke thick on the horizon, the sea frothing with landing craft, tracer fires streaking across the waves. Yet through it all, the ducks moved with quiet confidence. Where other landing craft grounded on reefs or stalled in the shallows, the DUKW simply kept going, rolling out of the surf, climbing over wet sand, and heading straight inland. Soldiers watched in disbelief as supplies and reinforcements appeared seemingly out of nowhere, ferried by trucks that looked like they had no business being on water. Within days, officers were calling them miracle machines. One British general, Sir Harold Alexander, declared, "It is not too much to say that the DUKW has revolutionized the problem of beach maintenance." What he meant was simple. Without these amphibious trucks, the invasion might have stalled on the sand. Instead, it pressed forward. The DUKW became a symbol of unstoppable momentum. It carried ammunition to gun lines under fire, hauled wounded men back to ships, and kept the machine of war turning even when nature and geography tried to halt it. Each one became a floating lifeline, connecting the vast naval armada offshore with the hungry front lines pushing inland. From Sicily, the Duck moved with the war, to Italy, to the Pacific, and eventually to the beaches of Normandy. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, more than 2,000 ducks churned through the cold gray waters of the English Channel. The sight was surreal, an armada not just of ships, but of trucks bobbing among them, their engines rumbling beneath the waves. When the ramp doors of landing ships dropped, ducks rolled out first, part scouts, part mules, part miracles. They ferried everything from 75mm howitzers to crates of rifle ammo, barrels of fuel, and boxes of medical supplies. It's estimated that nearly 40% of all supplies that reached Normandy's beaches during those first critical days arrived by DUKW. Without them, the Allied advance would have choked on its own logistics. But war is never kind to its heroes. The same waves that carried the DUKW to glory also claimed them without mercy. On Omaha Beach, the sea was rough, 3 to 6 feet of chop, the kind that buries small craft and breaks bigger ones. 12 ducks were sent toward the shore that morning, overloaded with gun crews, shells, and field artillery. Only one made it to land. The others swamped and sank within sight of the coast, their crews lost in the cold surf. Yet no one blamed the duck. It had done what it was built to do: carry the impossible through the unthinkable. Soldiers saw the losses as the cost of pushing forward, another toll paid to the sea. Across every theater, the duck's story was the same: improvisation and endurance. It crossed coral reefs in the Pacific, forded rivers in France, and bridged the Rhine when German engineers blew the crossings apart. When the war finally ended, thousands of DUKWs sat rusting in depots, their work finished but their legend sealed. In the years that followed, they became ghosts of a war that demanded too much from men and machines alike. But soon they would find new life in a world that no longer needed heroes, only novelty. When the guns finally fell silent, the Ducks' war was over. But its story wasn't. For a time, the DUKW stood as a symbol of victory. It had done the impossible, bridged the distance between sea and land, and helped carry the Allies across continents. Soldiers remembered it with affection, and in motor pools and scrap yards across the world, thousands of ducks sat waiting for their next chapter. But the peace they entered was a different kind of battlefield. Without war, the ducks' purpose evaporated. Armies no longer needed floating trucks, and nations began offloading surplus stockpiles by the thousands. They sold for a fraction of their cost, some to collectors, others to fishermen, and a few to people with far bigger imaginations. Those people saw opportunity. To them, the DUKW wasn't a relic. It was a spectacle, a machine that could drive down Main Street one moment and cruise a lake the next. The same versatility that made it invaluable to the military made it irresistible to entrepreneurs. By the 1950s and 60s, ducks began appearing in coastal towns and riverfront cities, painted in bright colors instead of olive drab. Tour guides replaced soldiers, families replaced infantrymen. Tourists laughed as the strange hybrid rumbled through city streets before plunging into the water to the sound of applause. The ducks had found a new purpose, not as tools of war, but as attractions of wonder. But there was a flaw in the dream. What serves the military well doesn't always serve civilians safely. The DUKW had been designed for utility, not longevity. It was never meant to live beyond its decade, and certainly not to carry passengers 70 years later. Its steel hulls, welded hurriedly in wartime factories, began to corrode. Parts wore down, pumps weakened, seals failed. The amphibious marvel that once defined reliability was quietly becoming a liability. Civilian operators tried to adapt. Many of them extended the hulls to fit more seats, added canopies to protect riders from sun and rain, and even enclosed the sides with vinyl windows to make the ride more comfortable. But every modification came at a cost. The longer, heavier ducks sat lower in the water. The canopies trapped heat, and, far worse, trapped passengers in the event of flooding. In engineering terms, they were no longer ducks. They were something older, heavier, and far more dangerous. The irony was cruel. The original DUKW had been engineered to withstand gunfire and surf, to save men under fire. Now, stripped of its armor and fitted with tourist seats, it was more vulnerable than ever. The qualities that once made it a war hero, lightweight construction, simple drainage systems, exposed machinery, were the same ones that would one day make it a death trap. By the 1990s, some of these machines had been operating for half a century. Yet inspections were inconsistent, maintenance expensive, and oversight minimal. Operators painted over rust, patched leaks with epoxy, and trusted that the old warhorse would keep floating like it always had. For a while, it did. Families kept lining up for the novelty of riding in a World War II duck. Children waved from the decks as the amphibious trucks splashed into lakes and harbors, oblivious to the corroding bolts beneath their feet. Tour guides cracked jokes. Cameras clicked. It was history repackaged as harmless fun, but the ocean and time never forgets. And in May of 1999, on a lake in Arkansas, one of these bright yellow ducks would remind the world that even legends can sink. Lake Hamilton, Arkansas, May 1st, 1999. The morning air was still, the kind of calm that hides its intentions. On the shore, a bright yellow duck named Miss Majestic idled as 20 passengers climbed aboard. To most, it was just a novelty tour, a short drive through hot springs, a gentle cruise on the lake, a slice of nostalgia. Few realized the vehicle beneath them had once rolled through the surf of war-torn Europe. Fewer still understood it had been built for battlefields, not family outings. The Miss Majestic was an original WWII DUKW, though hardly original in condition. Over the years, she'd been stretched, repainted, and refitted, her open-air military body now capped with a vinyl canopy, her deck raised, her stern heavier. She carried new electric bilge pumps and an aging hull beneath layers of paint and patchwork. Her steel skin, once built for one war, had now survived 5 decades of rain, rust, and neglect. The day before the accident, the captain noticed something strange. As the Miss Majestic cruised through the lake's quiet waters, the bilge pumps had been cycling on and off, a small warning of water where it didn't belong. When the tour ended, the driver watched as gallons drained from the hull, a steady stream that ran for 10 minutes straight. Mechanics inspected the craft and found a tear in the rubber boot around the rear drive shaft, the part that kept lake water out of the hull. It was repaired. The next morning, the Miss Majestic was cleared for service. At 11:30 a.m., the Duck rolled down the ramp into Lake Hamilton, her passengers laughing as the wheels met the water. The captain pointed out the life jacket stored under the canopy, though she couldn't pull one free from the shelf. No one worried. The lake was calm, the day warm, the ride easy. But within minutes of entering the water, something felt off. The Duck moved sluggishly, leaning to port. A passenger shifted seats at the captain's request to balance the weight. That's when he saw it, water lapping over the stern. "There's water coming in!" he shouted. He grabbed for life jackets and threw them to others, but confusion froze the group. Some laughed, unsure if he was joking. The Miss Majestic's captain turned for shore less than 100 feet away. She radioed for help, but no one heard the call. Within seconds, the back deck disappeared beneath the surface. The Duck listed hard to port, then vanished, swallowed by the lake in less than a minute. Nearby, boaters rushed to help, pulling survivors from the water. One teenage boy had jumped just before the sinking. Others clawed through the vinyl canopy as the vehicle went under. Inside, panic met darkness. Passengers trapped beneath the canopy found no air, no exits. The force of the water pinned them to their seats, the plastic roof acting as a net. 13 people drowned that morning, among them 3 children. When divers raised the Miss Majestic, the horror was still inside. Some passengers remained seated, others tangled in the canopy or lying on the lake floor just beyond the hull. The investigation revealed what the survivors already knew. The Duck had filled like a bucket. The repaired drive shaft boot had come loose, letting in water at 175 gallons per minute. Her bilge pumps, one broken, two too weak, never stood a chance. The Coast Guard's report was damning. The company had ignored clear warning signs. The bilge alarm didn't work. The pump system was inadequate. And the canopy, the same canopy meant to protect tourists from rain, had trapped them instead. In the aftermath, the Coast Guard issued advisories. The National Transportation Safety Board went further, recommending sweeping reforms. Remove canopies or make them easy to escape, divide the hull into watertight compartments, and inspect the vessels more rigorously. But the changes were never fully enforced. Operators argued they were costly, unnecessary, overreactions to a rare event. Yet the warning was clear, even if it went unheeded. The Duck's greatest flaw wasn't its design, it was the belief that an artifact of war could be tamed by time. And in the years that followed, more tragedies would prove that lesson was far from learned. Time has a way of softening memory. After the Miss Majestic tragedy, a few investigations came and went, a few headlines faded, and life and tourism went on. The Ducks kept rolling, kept splashing. In cities like Seattle, Boston, and Philadelphia, they became fixtures, as recognizable as trolley cars or ferry boats. Families climbed aboard for laughs and nostalgia, unaware that each ride was a gamble with history. But history has a cruel habit of repeating itself. It was July 7, 2010, on the Delaware River in Philadelphia. A bright green duck, number 34, drifted motionless in the water. Smoke, or what looked like smoke, had begun to fill the cabin, and the captain, thinking the engine was on fire, shut it down completely. He radioed for help, but no response came. Another duck nearby offered to tow them, but the captain waved it off, confident that everything was under control. He dropped anchor in the middle of the channel, and waited. Downriver, a tugboat named Caribbean Sea was pushing a 250-foot barge upriver. The mate on watch was distracted, not by machinery, not by charts, but by his phone. His son was in the hospital, and over the course of the next hour, he made 18 phone calls, spent over an hour in conversation, and checked his laptop again and again. He wasn't looking at the river. He wasn't looking at anything. The barge moved silently toward Duck 34. The captain aboard the Duck saw the looming shape, called again on Channel 13. Nothing. He taped the vents, shouted for passengers to put on life jackets, and made one final call on Channel 16. "Hey, ferry, whoa, whoa!" Seconds later, the 250-foot barge rolled right over the Duck. The sound was thunder and metal. The Duck vanished beneath the water in an instant, crushed and flipped. 2 passengers, teenagers visiting from Hungary, never made it out. When divers found them, they were still in their seats, buckled in, untouched by life jackets that had never been fastened. The investigation revealed everything that could go wrong did. A mate distracted by personal tragedy, a captain who'd anchored mid-channel, and safety systems that failed to prevent the obvious. It was another warning. Another chance to reform. But again, change came slowly, and not enough of it. 5 years later, on the opposite side of the country, another Duck would make headlines for all the wrong reasons. September 24th, 2015. Seattle, Washington. Duck 6 was heading south on the Aurora Bridge, an old, narrow stretch of highway suspended high above Lake Union. On board were 37 tourists. In the opposite lane, a charter bus full of college students. Witnesses remember hearing a metallic crack, a clunk-clunk, before the Duck suddenly veered left. Its front axle had sheared clean off. The amphibious truck swerved across the center line and slammed into the bus head-on. The Duck's pointed bow sliced open the side of the coach like a can opener. 5 students were killed instantly, dozens more injured. When investigators examined the wreck, they discovered the cause: a corroded axle housing, cracked for years, never repaired. The same phrase appeared again in the official report: poor maintenance. The same warning echoed: aging design. And then came Branson, July 19, 2018. Table Rock Lake, Missouri. A storm warning had been issued hours earlier, but the tour pressed on anyway. Stretch Duck 7, a modified DUKW with a longer hull and vinyl canopy, entered the water just as the first gusts arrived. Passengers laughed and waved as they set out. Within 10 minutes, the wind had risen to over 70 miles per hour. Waves built to 5 feet, crashing against the bow. The bilge alarm blared. The captain tried to turn toward shore less than 300 feet away. But the next wave rolled over the gunwale, filling the hull. The Duck listed, then sank beneath the surface in seconds. 17 people drowned. Entire families were lost: grandparents, children, even a 1-year-old baby. The captain survived, along with 13 others. It was the deadliest accident in Duck history, and it wasn't a mystery. The Coast Guard blamed the company for ignoring weather warnings. The NTSB blamed the Coast Guard itself for years of inaction, for ignoring the same safety reforms proposed after Miss Majestic 19 years earlier. The Ducks that had once saved men under gunfire were now drowning them under clear skies. The machines hadn't changed, only the world around them had. But their weaknesses, born in wartime haste and aged through decades of neglect, were no longer just flaws. They were fatal. In the wake of Branson, the world's fascination with the Duck finally curdled into unease. What had once been a quirky tourist attraction now looked like a rolling coffin. The images were impossible to ignore: the storm-darkened lake, the waves cresting over the bow, the canopy trapping families inside as the Duck slipped beneath the surface. 17 souls lost, the youngest just a baby. For the first time in decades, lawmakers and the media began asking the question that had been avoided since 1999. Why are these things still operating? Investigations poured in, lawsuits mounted. The U.S. Coast Guard and the National Transportation Safety Board, two agencies that had been at odds for years over jurisdiction, exchanged quiet accusations. The NTSB said it plainly: the Duck was never designed for the kind of work it now performed. It lacked watertight compartments, had no reserve buoyancy, and its canopies turned survivable accidents into mass drownings. They recommended reforms again, the same ones they'd proposed 19 years earlier. Remove all overhead coverings or redesign them for emergency egress. Re-engineer the hull to include flotation or segmentation. Inspect each vessel's integrity in water annually. Mandate stricter weather restrictions. But the Coast Guard's response was bureaucratic, hesitant. They issued new advisories, not laws, warnings, not requirements. Even after Branson, some tour operators continued business as usual, patching leaks and repainting hulls, confident the next tragedy would happen somewhere else. And yet, the writing was on the wall. Public trust had fractured. Duck tours closed in Boston, Seattle, Philadelphia, and eventually Branson itself. Lawsuits forced some operators into bankruptcy. Others quietly retired their fleets. A few survived, clinging to rebranded safety promises and newer replica amphibious buses that barely resembled the originals. But the old World War II hulls, the true DUKWs, were done. Their ghosts, however, remained. Historians and engineers began revisiting the Duck's story with a new kind of respect, not for its modern failures, but for the context of its birth. The DUKW was a product of urgency, built not for comfort, but for victory. In 1942, engineers weren't designing a pleasure craft. They were designing survival. Its thin steel walls, open compartments, and single-screw propulsion were never meant to endure decades of saltwater corrosion, retrofitted engines, and tourist weight. In war, the Duck was brilliant because it didn't need to be perfect, only good enough to last a few campaigns. But in peace, good enough is never enough. The very qualities that made it revolutionary on the beaches of Sicily doomed it on the calm waters of Missouri. Its low freeboard, simple drainage system, and unarmored body, once symbols of efficiency, became liabilities. And every retrofit, every added seat, canopy, and sound system only pushed it closer to failure. The truth was hard to admit. The Duck was never a villain, just misunderstood. Its tragedy lay in human arrogance, in the belief that something built for chaos could be domesticated for leisure. Even now, some Ducks sit rusting in storage lots, their once proud hulls pitted and flaking, faded names still visible under layers of paint. Others were sold to collectors or museums, where they stand like fossils of human innovation and oversight. The Duck began as an emblem of ingenuity, a bridge between land and sea, necessity and invention. It ended as a warning, a reminder that even miracles of engineering carry expiration dates, and that nostalgia is no substitute for safety. And yet, despite everything, despite the wreckage, the lawsuits, the warnings, somewhere, on some quiet waterfront, a brightly painted Duck still rumbles to life, its old 6-cylinder engine coughing into motion. Tourists still laugh as it drives toward the water, the guide cracking jokes over the intercom. For a moment, the world forgets. But the lake never forgets. And the duck never forgives. History has a way of repeating itself, not in noise, but in echoes. The DUKW was born from a moment of necessity, from a war that demanded the impossible. And for a time, it delivered. It ferried ammunition through surf and smoke, carried wounded men to safety, and bridged the gap between chaos and control. In those years, it was everything humanity hoped its machines could be: dependable, selfless, unstoppable. But time changes the way we remember our creations. What begins as triumph often ends as tragedy when memory dulls and purpose fades. The duck was built for urgency, for an era when failure meant death and innovation meant survival. Once that era passed, the urgency went with it. The engineers retired, the soldiers went home, and the ducks sat in storage, their metal skins rusting in the quiet. Then, decades later, someone saw potential where others saw ruin. They painted the hulls yellow and blue, replaced guns with benches, and turned the roar of war into the laughter of tourism. History had been repackaged for entertainment. The old warhorse turned into a sideshow attraction. But beneath the paint, the steel still remembered. Every dent, every weld, every joint that had faced the violence of the sea was now being asked to face it again, this time without purpose, just for profit. There's something deeply human about that, the way we turn relics into novelties, forgetting the lessons they were built to teach. The DUKW's purpose was survival, not spectacle. Its genius lay in function, not comfort. And when we tried to make it both, the ocean reminded us why it was never meant to be. The wrecks of the Miss Majestic, Duck 34, Duck 6, and Stretch Duck 7 now rest in quiet water, their stories sealed beneath layers of silt and silence. Families still visit those lakes and rivers without knowing what lies beneath. And somewhere on a weathered dock, another duck sits, tied to its post, its paint bright, but its bolts tired, waiting for another season. There's a melancholy kind of symmetry in it, a machine that once carried men through war, now undone by peace. The same seas that crowned it a hero later pulled it back down to the depths it once defied. It's hard not to see the metaphor. Maybe that's what makes the duck so haunting. It represents both the best and worst of human ambition. It shows how brilliance born from crisis can become blindness when misused. The DUKW didn't fail because it was poorly made. It failed because we forgot why it was made. In the end, every invention carries two legacies, the one we celebrate and the one we ignore. The DUKW carries both. It was a triumph of wartime engineering and a tragedy of peacetime complacency. When the waves close over metal, they erase the noise, but not the story. Somewhere, in the quiet depths of Table Rock Lake or the Delaware River, an old steel hull rests, once a symbol of survival, now a warning written in rust. Because even legends can sink, and sometimes the sound they make on the way down is just the echo of us, repeating the same mistakes, hoping they'll float this time.